Grand Admiral Excelthor of the Zarkax Empire stood before the massive holographic display, his scaled brow ridges furrowing in confusion. The sensor readings couldn't be right. He flicked his ceremonial cape aside with one of his forearms and leaned closer to the display, mandibles clicking in irritation. "Explain to me again," he rumbled, "why the mighty Zarkax Empire should concern itself with these miniature vessels." Senior Analyst Verica stepped forward, her crystalline data interface grafted to her skull glowing softly in the dim light of the command center. "My lord, while the human vessels appear small, our readings indicate energy signatures that defy conventional understanding." "Defy understanding?" Zelthor's laugh echoed through the chamber. "They defy basic military doctrine. Their largest ship is barely the size of our scout vessels. The entire human fleet could fit in our primary hangar bay with room to spare." The massive command center of the Zarkax flagship, Eternal Dominion, hummed with nervous energy as other officers studied their own readings. The tactical display showed what appeared to be a collection of human vessels advancing through the Orion Arm, each no larger than a typical supply ship. Verka's interface crystals pulsed with urgency. "My lord, I must insist you examine these readings more closely. The mass-to-volume ratio of these vessels, it's impossible. They're somehow containing more mass than their visible dimensions should allow." Before Zelthor could dismiss her concerns again, a communication request flashed across the main display. The Admiral's upper arms crossed in annoyance as he granted permission for the transmission. The hologram materialized, showing a human female in a crisp blue uniform. Her dark hair was pulled back tightly, and her expression carried what Zelthor would later learn humans called a knowing smile. "This is Admiral Sarah Chen of the Earth Federation ship Quantum Dawn," she announced. "I understand you've been studying our fleet with great interest, Grand Admiral Excelthor." Zelthor's mandibles clicked in amusement. "Merely professional curiosity, Admiral Chen. Though I must admit, your species' approach to shipbuilding is unique. Perhaps humans simply lack the resources for proper warships." Chen's smile widened slightly. "Or perhaps, Admiral, we simply found a better way. You see, humanity learned long ago that bigger isn't always better. Sometimes, the most elegant solution comes in a small package." "Elegant?" Zelthor scoffed. "Your entire fleet barely registers on our tactical displays. What could such tiny vessels hope to?" His words died in his throat as the sensor readings suddenly spiked. Throughout the human fleet, ships began to shimmer with an impossible energy signature. "What you're seeing," Chen explained calmly, "is our quantum shell technology in action." Dr. Amit Patel theorized that space itself could be folded around a vessel, creating a pocket dimension that allows us to pack the power of a dreadnought into the size of a corvette. "Would you like a demonstration?" Before Zelthor could respond, the smallest ship in the human fleet, barely larger than a shuttle, began to glow. Space itself seemed to ripple around it as layers of advanced weaponry emerged from seemingly nowhere, unfolding from quantum space into reality. What had appeared to be a simple scout vessel now bristled with enough firepower to threaten a capital ship. "Impossible," Verka gasped, her interface crystals strobing with alarm. "They're manipulating dimensional space at will." "Nothing is impossible," Chen replied. "Humanity simply chose to think differently. While other species focused on building bigger ships, we focused on making our ships bigger on the inside than the outside. More efficient, more elegant." She paused, her expression growing serious. "Now, about those colonies you've been threatening." Zelthor's lower arms instinctively reached for the tactical controls as his upper arms gripped his command chair. The sensor readings were now showing energy signatures that shouldn't exist in normal space. Each human vessel was revealing itself to be a quantum puzzle box of military might, with weapons and systems emerging from folded spacetime. "I suggest," Chen continued, "that we discuss terms for a peaceful resolution. Unless, of course, you'd like to see what happens when we fully deploy our quantum shell technology. I should warn you, the physics can get rather Interesting. As Selthor watched another seemingly tiny human vessel unfold impossible arrays of advanced weaponry from quantum space, he realized that everything he knew about warfare had just changed. The Zarkax Empire had always relied on the psychological impact of their massive ships, but how do you intimidate an enemy that had learned to pack the power of a fleet into vessels that could hide in plain sight? Perhaps, he said carefully, all four arms raised in a gesture of peace, we should discuss those terms, Admiral Chen. Chen's smile returned. I was hoping you'd say that. After all, in my experience, the best victories are the ones where you never have to fire a shot. Though I must admit, part of me was looking forward to showing you what happens when we really let our ships stretch their quantum legs. As diplomatic channels were opened and terms began to be discussed, Selthor couldn't help but overhear one of his junior officers muttering, "No wonder humans never built bigger ships. They were too busy learning how to break the laws of physics with the small ones." The age of massive warships was over. The era of quantum warfare had begun, and humanity, the underestimated newcomers, held all the cards. Dr. Amit Patel stood before the gathered Zarkax delegation in the Earth Federation's primary research facility, suppressing a smile as he watched their mandibles twitch with barely contained frustration. The holographic display behind him showed the schematics of what appeared to be an impossibly simple engine design. You expect us to believe? Chief Engineer Vexnar clicked, all six of his eyes narrowing, that this basic containment matrix is the foundation of your quantum shell technology. The simplest solutions are often the most elegant, Amit replied, adjusting his glasses. The movement drew attention to the subtle neural interface wrapped around his left temple, a reminder that humanity's apparent simplicity often hid deeper complexities. The meeting had been arranged as part of the peace negotiations, a good-faith sharing of technological insights. What the Zarkax didn't realize was that understanding the principles and actually replicating them were two very different challenges. Perhaps a demonstration would help, Amit suggested, gesturing to what appeared to be a simple metal cube on the table. This container is exactly 1 cubic meter in external dimensions. Would one of you care to reach inside? Vexnar stepped forward, his massive frame dwarfing the human scientist. With obvious skepticism, he reached toward the opening of the cube and kept reaching. His arm went in well past the point where it should have hit the bottom. His mandibles clicked rapidly in shock as he withdrew his arm. Impossible. The internal space is at least 10 meters deep. 13.4, actually, Amit corrected. We call it spatial compression, but that's not entirely accurate. We're not really compressing space, we're folding it. Think of it like origami, but with the fabric of reality itself. Back on the Zarkax flagship, Grand Admiral Selthor reviewed the footage from the demonstration with growing unease. And they just gave us this information. Freely. Verka's interface crystals pulsed as she analyzed the data. Not exactly, my lord. Our best engineers have been studying the principles for days. The physics make perfect sense, but every attempt to replicate the effect has failed catastrophically. It's as if we're missing something fundamental. Of course you are, a new voice chimed in. Admiral Chen's hologram appeared, making Selthor wonder, not for the first time, how humans always seem to time their communications so perfectly. You see, Chen continued, Dr. Patel showed you how quantum shell technology works, but not why it works. The key isn't in the engineering, it's in the thinking behind it. Meanwhile, in his private lab, Amit was having a very different conversation with his research partner, Dr. Maria Santos. They still don't get it, do they? She asked, monitoring the quantum field readings from their latest test. How could they? Amit replied, watching as a test vessel the size of a cargo container unfolded into a fully equipped research station. They're still trying to approach it from a purely technical perspective. They haven't realized that quantum shell technology only works because we stop trying to force reality to follow our rules. Instead, we learn to fold our rules to match reality, Maria finished, smiling. Though I have to admit, watching them try to replicate it with brute force calculations is somewhat entertaining. Their conversation was interrupted by an alert. Somewhere in the Orion Arm, a Zarkax research facility had just experienced a catastrophic failure attempting to generate a quantum shell. The resulting spatial distortion had collapsed an area roughly 2 kilometers in diameter into a space smaller than a marble. And that, Amit sighed, is why we insisted on the technology sharing agreement. Better they fail under controlled conditions than figure it out just enough to cause real damage. Admiral Chen's hologram flickered in Selthor's command center as she continued her explanation. Quantum shell technology isn't just about the science. It's about accepting that your preconceptions about how space should work are just that, preconceptions. Humanity succeeded because we were willing to think small when everyone else was thinking big. But surely, Selthor argued, with enough study, with enough resources. You still don't understand, Chen interrupted gently. You can't brute force this. Your empire's entire philosophy is built around size equals power. You're trying to use quantum shells to make bigger weapons, bigger ships. That's exactly why it won't work for you. Verka's crystals pulsed with sudden insight. The quantum shells. They're not about making small ships act like big ones, are they? Now you're getting it. Chen smiled. They're about understanding that size itself is an illusion. Our ships aren't small ships pretending to be big ones. They're exactly as big as they need to be, in exactly the way they need to be. As if to emphasize her point, a human vessel barely larger than a fighter craft appeared on their sensors. As they watched, it unfolded layer after layer of quantum space, not to reveal weapons or engines, but to deploy a fully functional field hospital capable of treating thousands. You see, Chen continued, we didn't develop quantum shells for war. We developed them because we needed to fit big solutions into small spaces. The military applications were almost an afterthought. Kxelthor sat back in his command chair, all 4 arms limp with revelation. His empire had spent generations building bigger ships, more powerful weapons, larger fleets, and in a matter of days, humanity had rendered that entire philosophy obsolete not through superior firepower, but through superior thinking. Perhaps, he said slowly, we have been approaching this entire situation from the wrong perspective. That, Chen replied, is the first step toward understanding quantum shell technology. The question isn't how to make it work, it's why it works in the first place. And that answer lies not in the mathematics of spatial folding, but in the simple truth that sometimes the biggest changes come in the smallest packages. In his lab, Amit watched the sensor readings from the failed Zarkax experiment with a mixture of concern and relief. They'll figure it out eventually, he mused. The technology? Maria asked. No, he smiled, the philosophy. And when they do, that's when things will really get interesting. The Rigel defense line had stood unbroken for 3 centuries. Its massive fortifications, built by the combined might of 7 elder species, were considered impenetrable. The Hive Collective's attack fleet stretched across 2 light-years of space, their bioorganic dreadnoughts dwarfing even the Zarkax's largest vessels. Admiral Chen watched the tactical display aboard the Quantum Dawn, her expression unreadable. The Hive had ignored all warnings, all diplomatic overtures. Now they threatened both human and Zarkax space, confident that their overwhelming numbers would prevail. They still don't understand, she murmured. Her XO, Commander James Rodriguez, nodded. They're counting ships, Admiral, just like everyone else did. The Hive fleet advanced, their ships moving in perfect synchronization. Their collective consciousness allowed them to coordinate with machine-like precision, each vessel part of a greater whole. Leading the charge were massive breach ships, each designed to slam through defensive lines through sheer mass. Launch the Whispers, Chen ordered. Across the human fleet, launch bays no larger than escape pods cycled open. What emerged seemed almost laughable. Vessels barely larger than shuttles, each crewed by only 2 or 3 people. The Hive paid them no attention. Their sensors focused on threats they could understand. That was their first mistake. Quantum shells active, Rodriguez reported. Whisper squadrons reporting ready. Chen's fingers drummed once on her armrest. Execute Operation Origami. The space around the tiny human vessels began to ripple, but instead of unfolding into larger configurations, they seemed to fold inward, becoming even smaller. Soon, they were barely visible to the naked eye. Interesting approach. Zelthor's voice came through the comm. The Zarkak's admiral had remained skeptical of Chen's plan, but his recent experiences had taught him to watch and learn. You're making your ship smaller. Size is relative, Chen replied. Watch. The Whisper squadrons accelerated toward the Hive fleet. Their quantum shells had compressed them to near microscopic dimensions, making them virtually invisible to conventional sensors. But they weren't just smaller, they were denser. Each ship now contained its mass compressed into a space smaller than a grain of sand. They slipped through the Hive's shields as if they weren't there. Conventional defense screens were calibrated for ships of normal mass and volume. They had no way to detect or stop vessels that existed primarily in folded space. Now, Chen commanded. The Whispers began to unfold, not outward, into normal space, but inward, into the quantum dimensions they had created. Each tiny ship expanded into its own pocket of folded spacetime, taking small segments of the Hive ships with them. From the outside, it looked as though perfectly circular holes were appearing in the massive bioorganic vessels, segments of their hull simply ceasing to exist. By the first egg, Zelthor breathed. You're not attacking their ships. You're removing parts of them from our reality. Quantum shells don't just let us fold space around our ships, Shen explained as the Hive fleet fell into chaos. They let us fold space itself. Each Whisper creates its own pocket universe. Anything caught in the fold either comes with us or stays behind. The Hive responded with overwhelming firepower, but their weapons were designed to engage capital ships and strike fleets. Trying to target the Whispers was like trying to shoot individual bacteria with a continental defense cannon. The tiny ships continued their work, systematically removing critical systems and structural components from the massive Hive vessels. Admiral, Rodriguez reported, the Hive is attempting to adapt. They're redirecting power to some kind of quantum detection grid. Chen nodded. Right on schedule. Signal the quantum dawn. Time for us to show them why we keep most of our ship in folded space. Her own vessel, which had appeared no larger than a light cruiser, began to unfold. But this wasn't the standard combat deployment they'd shown the Zarkaks. Layer after layer of quantum space rippled outward, revealing systems and technologies that defied conventional understanding. The quantum dawn didn't become larger, not exactly. Instead, it seemed to exist in multiple spaces simultaneously, its quantum shell creating a lattice of overlapping realities. Weapons fired from positions that couldn't exist, shields projected from dimensions that shouldn't be possible. Fascinating, Zelthor mused. Your ships don't just use quantum shells for storage or deployment. The technology is integral to their entire design philosophy. Exactly. Chen confirmed as the Hive fleet's coordination began to break down. Their collective consciousness couldn't process the sensor data from ships that existed in multiple spatial configurations simultaneously. We didn't adapt quantum shells to work with our ships. We designed our ships to work with quantum shells from the ground up. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted less than an hour. The mighty Hive fleet, terror of 7 sectors, was reduced to scattered fragments by ships they could barely detect. The Whispers had systematically removed critical systems, while the Quantum Dawn's multidimensional assault had shattered their collective consciousness. As the surviving Hive ships retreated in disarray, Zelthor's hologram turned to Chen. You could have done this to us, couldn't you? When we first encountered your fleet, we could have, she acknowledged. But we preferred to make allies rather than enemies. The galaxy is changing, Admiral. The age of brute force is over. We're entering an era where understanding the nature of space itself is more important than how many guns you can mount on a dreadnought. In the aftermath of the battle, as recovery ships began collecting the scattered pieces of Hive vessels for study, Rodriguez approached Chen privately. "Do you think they'll understand the real lesson here?" Chen watched as a Whisper squadron escorted a Zarkak science vessel, its tiny size belying its true capabilities. Some will. The smart ones. The ones who realized that today wasn't about quantum shells or folded space or even military technology. What was it about? Perspective, she smiled. The understanding that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't how big you are or how many ships you have. It's the ability to look at the same space everyone else sees and realize that reality has more dimensions than anyone imagined. The Galactic Council chamber buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from 17 species argued over the latest disaster. On the central display, footage played of a Proxian research station collapsing into a quantum singularity, taking half of their moon-sized military installation with it. That's the 7th catastrophic failure this month, High Chancellor Zyra of the Meridian Confederation announced, her crystalline form pulsing with worry. How many more facilities must we lose before we accept that quantum shell technology cannot be replicated? Dr. Amit Patel stood calmly at the podium, watching the chaos unfold. Behind him, Admiral Chen remained equally composed, though her eyes reflected concern for the mounting casualties of failed experiments. "Distinguished representatives," Emmett began, his voice cutting through the noise. "You're all approaching this from the wrong direction. You keep trying to reverse engineer our technology without understanding its fundamental nature." "Then explain it to us," demanded the Proxian delegate, his tentacles writhing in agitation. "Your species shares the principles freely, yet every attempt to implement them ends in disaster." "Because," Chen stepped forward, "you're trying to adapt quantum shells to your existing technology. It's like trying to install modern computer software on ancient hardware. The architecture simply isn't compatible." The chamber fell silent as a new hologram materialized, a simple quantum shell demonstration. As they watched, a human vessel no larger than a shuttle seamlessly shifted through multiple spatial configurations, each transformation smooth and natural. "The key isn't in the technology," Amit explained. "It's in the foundation. We didn't build our ships and then add quantum shells. We built our entire technological base around the principles of spatial manipulation from the ground up." In the upper observation gallery, Verka watched with her interface crystals pulsing rapidly. Since the Zarkak's Empire's alliance with humanity, she'd been studying human quantum mechanics. Finally, something clicked. "They're not using technology at all," she whispered to Excelfor. "At least, not in the way we understand it." The Grand Admiral turned to her. "Explain." "Look at their ships, their equipment, even their civilian vessels. Everything they build incorporates quantum principles at the most basic level. It's not a technology they use. It's a fundamental part of how they interact with space itself." On the council floor, the debate had turned to economic concerns. The mercantile guilds were in an uproar over how quantum shell shipping was revolutionizing trade. Traditional cargo haulers were becoming obsolete as human vessels a fraction of their size delivered vastly larger payloads. "The market disruption is unprecedented," the guild master complained. "How can we compete with ships that are bigger on the inside than the outside?" "That's precisely the problem," Emmett responded. "You're trying to compete instead of adapt. We're offering partnership programs, teaching opportunities, collaborative research initiatives. Yet most species are more interested in stealing or copying our technology than understanding it." A new alert flashed across the chamber's displays. The collective mind of the Synaptic Union had just lost another research facility to a quantum containment failure. The death toll was still being calculated. "Enough." Chen's voice cut through the renewed chaos. "As of this moment, the Earth Federation is suspending all unauthorized quantum shell research by other species. We will not stand by and watch more lives be lost to impatience and pride." Outrage erupted from multiple delegations, but Chen held up her hand. The gesture was simple, yet somehow commanded attention from beings that could crush her with tentacles or dissolve her with acid. Instead, she continued, we are establishing the Quantum Education Initiative. Any species willing to learn from the ground up, to rebuild their understanding of spatial mechanics from first principles, will be welcome to participate. But there will be no more shortcuts, no more attempts to force quantum shells to work with incompatible systems. In the gallery, Zelthor nodded slowly. They're not just changing how we build ships, he mused. They're changing how we think about space itself. Verka's crystals pulsed in agreement, and those who adapt will thrive, while those who resist. She gestured to the footage still playing of the Proxian disaster. The message was clear: evolve or be left behind. As the council session ended, Amit and Chen walked together through the station's quantum-folded corridors, spaces that seemed to loop back on themselves in impossible ways, while remaining perfectly navigable to those who understood their nature. They'll come around, Amit said confidently. The smart ones already are. The Zarkax's willingness to rebuild their understanding from scratch has put them years ahead of other species. And the others will learn the hard way that the universe doesn't care about their pride or their traditions. Physics isn't something you can bully or bribe. You either understand it or you don't. Chen smiled as they passed a viewing window. Outside, a human transport no larger than a passenger shuttle was effortlessly towing a disabled Proxian dreadnought through folded space. Sometimes, she mused, the biggest change isn't in how you do things, but in accepting that everything you thought you knew about how things should be done might be wrong. The galaxy was changing, not through force of arms or economic might, but through the simple, inexorable power of a better idea. And humanity, the species that had learned to fold space like paper, was leading the way. The galactic core glowed through the quantum-folded observation deck of Earth's new embassy station. 3 years had passed since humanity first revealed their quantum shell technology, and the galaxy had changed more in that time than in the previous millennium. Admiral Chen stood with Dr. Amit Patel and their Zarkax allies, watching as vessels of various species navigated the complex layers of folded space around the station. Some moved confidently, having embraced the new understanding of spatial mechanics. Others stuck to traditional space lanes, still wary of quantum navigation. The first graduation ceremony from the Quantum Education Initiative, Zelthor observed, his 4 arms clasped behind his back. I never thought I'd see the day when a hive queen would study alongside a Proxian void master. Understanding breaks down barriers, Amit replied, adjusting his neural interface. It's harder to fear or hate someone when you're both struggling to grasp why quantum shells collapse if you think about them too literally. A flash of light announced the arrival of the collective mind's representative, their crystalline form now incorporating subtle quantum fluctuations. The rogue elements have been contained, they announced without preamble. Those who sought to weaponize incomplete quantum knowledge have been educated. Chen nodded grimly. The past year had seen desperate attempts by various factions to militarize poorly understood quantum principles. The results had been predictably catastrophic, but at least now there was a framework for preventing such disasters. Speaking of education, Verka chimed in, her interface crystals pulsing with excitement. The latest research from the Joint Human Zarkax Institute is promising. We've finally begun to understand why quantum shells respond to cognitive resonance. Ah, Amit smiled. You've discovered that thinking about space differently literally allows you to interact with it differently. It's revolutionary. The mathematical model suggest. Verka stopped, her crystals flickering. That was a test, wasn't it? You already knew. Knowing and understanding are different things, Amit replied. Just like thinking a space should be bigger isn't the same as understanding why it can be bigger. Their conversation was interrupted by a priority alert. A massive fleet had just appeared at the edge of monitored space, the combined might of 3 species who had rejected quantum integration. Their ships were enormous, built according to traditional principles of power projection. Here we go again, Chen sighed. Some people really need to learn the hard way. The defense fleet that responded to the incursion wasn't the tiny collection of human vessels that had once surprised the Zarkax. Now it was a joint force, human, Zarkax, and other graduates of the initiative, each bringing their own understanding of quantum mechanics to create something entirely new. Ships phased through multiple spatial dimensions, their quantum shells working in harmony to create defensive patterns that couldn't exist in normal space. Vessels the size of shuttles projected shield geometries that encompassed entire star systems. Weapon systems operated through folded space, bypassing traditional defenses as if they weren't there. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 15 minutes. Fascinating approach, Zelthor commented as they watched the after-action reports. The high ships using quantum shells to establish a collective consciousness across folded space, coordinating with the Meridian long-range sensors. We never would have thought of combining technologies that way in the old paradigm. That's because the old paradigm was about domination through force, Chen replied. The quantum understanding is about integration, about seeing how different approaches can fold together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. In the aftermath, as recovery ships began assisting the disabled vessels of the would-be invaders, Amit turned to the assembled representatives. 3 years ago, humanity revealed quantum shell technology to the galaxy. Many of you feared it would lead to an arms race, to new weapons of mass destruction. Instead, it's led to something else entirely. A revolution in thinking. Verka completed the thought, her crystals pulsing with understanding. We didn't just learn new technology. We learned new ways of seeing reality itself. The observation deck shifted, its quantum-folded space offering a view of Earth's solar system. Humanity's homeworld looked tiny from this distance, yet it had changed the galaxy not through size or might, but through the simple act of thinking differently about space itself. The future isn't about who has the biggest ships or the strongest weapons, Chen mused. It's about who can best understand and work with the fundamental nature of space itself. And that understanding only comes when you're willing to accept that everything you thought you knew might be wrong. And to think, Zelthor chuckled, it all started because we laughed at the size of your ships. Size is relative. Amit smiled. Importance is relative. Even space itself is relative. The only constant is change, and those who adapt to change are the ones who shape the future. As they watched, a new class of vessel emerged from Earth's shipyards, one designed and built by a joint team of 17 species, incorporating quantum principles that couldn't have been imagined 3 years ago. It was tiny by traditional standards, but its quantum signature suggested capabilities that would have seemed like magic to their past selves. So, Chen asked the assembled representatives, what impossible thing shall we achieve next? The responses came not in words but in quantum fluctuations, each species contributing their unique understanding to a growing dialogue about the nature of reality itself. The galaxy had entered a new age, not one of conquest or competition, but of collaboration and discovery. And it all started because humanity decided that maybe, just maybe, the biggest solutions didn't need to come in the biggest packages. The quantum shells hummed their agreement, folding space itself around the observers until the barriers between species, between perspectives, between different ways of thinking, became as fluid as space itself. The age of quantum understanding had truly begun.